Have you ever witnessed a moment so raw, so real, that it shattered everything you thought a debate could be? On live television, Bill Maher mocked faith, calling it a fantasy for the weak. Millions watched, expecting a clash of egos. But what happened next left the world holding its breath, because Denzel Washington didn't argue back. He revealed a truth so powerful, so devastating, that even Bill Maher couldn't find words to respond. Before we dive into this unforgettable encounter, if you believe in standing strong even when the world doubts you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Where are you watching this video from? We love hearing from you and always read every message. The studio lights burned overhead like artificial suns, casting long shadows across the gleaming floor. A charged tension buzzed through the air, thick enough to feel crawling along the skin. Cameras floated silently, their red record lights blinking like quiet witnesses to an unseen storm. Across a polished glass table, two men sat facing each other. Denzel Washington embodying a serene but unbreakable calm, and Bill Maher exuding the restless energy of a man eager to dismantle illusions. Millions tuned in, not for entertainment, but for something rarer, an authentic collision between the rational and the spiritual. Beyond the camera's gaze, producers murmured frantically into headsets, coordinating angles, adjusting focus, but none could orchestrate the gravity settling over the room. In the control booth, a senior producer muttered under his breath, "This isn't just a debate. It's a storm brewing." And indeed, between Denzel's stillness and Bill's sharpened posture, an invisible cord of tension pulled tighter with every heartbeat. This wasn't merely an intellectual disagreement, it was the clash of two different ways of surviving the brutalities of life. The moderator's voice, though steady, seemed almost ceremonial as he introduced the night's topic: faith, atheism, and the resilience of the human spirit. His words felt distant, as if echoing from the pews of an ancient cathedral. As the microphone passed to the speakers, a subtle moment unfolded. Denzel bowed his head ever so slightly, centering himself not in argument, but in something deeper. Bill caught the gesture and smirked, mistaking it for weakness before the battle had even begun. For a heartbeat longer, silence dominated the space, thick and sacred, pressing against the walls like the moment before a courtroom delivers its verdict. Across countless homes, audiences leaned closer to their screens, instinctively understanding that what they were about to witness could not be easily unwound. Even the studio lights seemed to recede slightly, as if the room itself recognized the weight of the confrontation to come. Bill Maher leaned into his microphone first, a gleam of practiced derision in his eyes, yet Denzel did not flinch. His gaze, dark, weathered, and infinitely patient, held steady, not as a challenge but as a testament. He didn't need to prepare for war. He carried the scars of battles already fought, unseen but undeniable. And in that first silent exchange, before a single argument was spoken, something ancient stirred among the watchers: respect, fear, and the unspoken understanding that not all strength can be measured by intellect. This would not be a contest of cleverness. It would be something rawer, more dangerous, a revelation about endurance, about the unseen wars each soul carries, and about which forces truly endure when all words finally fail. Bill Maher broke the sacred stillness with a voice sharpened by years of public combat. "Faith," he said, dragging the word out just enough to coat it in disdain, "is a fantasy for weak minds." His smile widened slightly as he let the accusation hang in the air, like a gauntlet thrown at Denzel's feet. A soft ripple of awkward laughter flickered through the studio audience, uncertain, nervous, not entirely sure if they were witnessing bravery or cruelty. Bill leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as if he'd already claimed the high ground without needing to scale it. Denzel didn't blink. He sat as still as a statue carved from something older than certainty, his gaze fixed on Bill, not with anger, but with the kind of patience forged in hardship. He seemed to understand that the first to lash out would be the first to lose. Behind the cameras, the crew barely breathed, sensing that something fragile and immense was balancing on the edge of the moment. In living rooms around the world, viewers shifted forward unconsciously, drawn by the gravitational pull of an unseen battle taking form. Bill pressed his advantage, emboldened by the lack of immediate resistance. Hope, prayer, belief, Fairy tales we tell ourselves when we're too afraid to face the chaos head-on. His words floated into the silence like arrows, designed not to wound the flesh, but to mock the soul. He smiled again, a performance perfected over decades of dismantling what others held sacred. But in front of him, Denzel remained unmoved, as if the arrows had dissolved before reaching him. The moderator shifted uncomfortably, sensing the imbalance in the room. The audience's laughter had already faded into an expectant hush. Bill's confidence faltered just a fraction, too small for him to acknowledge, but enough to stir unease in those watching closely. It wasn't the brilliance of Denzel's silence that unnerved Bill. It was the unshakable stillness, the refusal to play by the rules of intellectual sparring. Finally, Denzel moved, not to counter, not to defend, but to simply adjust the way he sat, leaning forward slightly with the gravity of a man preparing not for a fight, but for a confession. His hands rested lightly on the table, open palms facing upward. A gesture not of confrontation but of offering. Bill saw it but didn't understand it yet. The audience, however, felt it. Something old, something real, rising slowly through the floor and into their bones. At that moment, the energy of the room shifted. This wasn't going to be the demolition Bill had envisioned. This wasn't going to be about clever retorts and applause lines. Denzel wasn't here to win a debate. He was here to reveal a truth too deep for wit to touch. A truth about suffering, endurance, and a kind of faith that didn't ask for validation to be real. The silence that followed Bill's opening assault wasn't empty. It was loaded, vibrating like the charged air before a storm. In that thick stillness, every eye in the room flickered between the two men, searching for signs of retreat or retaliation. But Denzel offered neither. He simply breathed, slow and steady, grounding himself deeper into something unseen, but unmistakably powerful. That kind of patience unnerved even the most seasoned debaters. It wasn't the patience of ignorance. It was the patience of someone who knew that real strength didn't rush to prove itself. Bill tapped his fingers lightly on the table, a subconscious tick betraying his irritation at the lack of immediate pushback. His smirk wavered, just enough for the most observant viewers to catch. For a man used to quick victories and easy applause, Denzel's calm was not just confusing, it was disruptive. It denied him the rhythm he needed to dominate. Every second Denzel remained silent was a second that stretched the audience's attention away from Bill's cleverness and toward something deeper. The atmosphere thickened, the lights overhead seeming hotter, heavier. Some in the studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that this was not a debate as they knew it. It felt older, more primal, like watching two opposing forces of nature, one loud and flashing, the other slow and inexorable, grinding forward with unstoppable quiet. Phones buzzed in pockets as live comments flooded social media. Viewers struggling to name the strange gravity pulling at their emotions. Bill, sensing the ground subtly slipping beneath him, decided to double down. He leaned forward, voice rising slightly, layering on more sarcasm, more scorn. "Come on, Denzel, tell us how faith fixes anything. Tell us how fairy tales keep the world from falling apart." The words were crafted to sting, but they carried a whiff of desperation now, like a fighter throwing wild punches as he tires. Bill was trying to recapture control, not just of the conversation, but of the audience's soul. Denzel finally shifted his weight slightly forward, his gaze locking onto Bill's with a steady, devastating clarity. No anger, no rush, no showmanship, just the quiet force of a man who had buried friends, walked through private hells, and come out not victorious but intact. That kind of survival wasn't a theory to him. It was a daily, conscious choice, stitched into every breath. And that, more than any argument, began to turn the tide in the hearts of those watching. In the control room, a producer whispered, almost reverently, "He's not debating, he's witnessing." And somewhere, deep in the collective consciousness of the viewers, a shift occurred. People weren't picking sides anymore. They were feeling something bigger than the debate, bigger than the men on stage, something that smelled like the truth. When the moderator finally invited Denzel to respond, the room seemed to hold its breath. He didn't rush. He didn't fire back with statistics or theological arguments. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice low but rich with a gravity that demanded attention. "Faith," he began, pausing as if feeling the weight of the word itself, "is not a shield against pain. It's the courage to walk through it without losing yourself." The words landed with a force that no volume or bravado could match, resonating somewhere deeper than the ears, into the marrow of those listening. Bill smiled thinly, prepared to counter, but something had changed. The sharpness in his demeanor dulled for just a flicker, as if recognizing that Denzel wasn't offering a target for attack. He was offering an experience. Across the audience, heads tilted, brows furrowed, not in skepticism, but in reluctant understanding. Denzel wasn't trying to win them. He was inviting them into a different kind of survival story, one written not in victories but in endurance. Denzel continued, his words slow and deliberate, weaving through the air like smoke from a sacred fire. Life doesn't ask if you're ready. It doesn't care if you're strong. It simply happens. Faith isn't pretending the storm won't come. Dead standing when it does, broken, battered, but still yourself. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the honesty of someone speaking from scars, not theories. The studio, once primed for intellectual jousting, grew heavy with a different kind of electricity, a rawness that no clever retort could match. The tension wasn't about who would deliver the smartest punchline anymore. It was about who could bear to stand naked before the chaos of existence without flinching. And in that arena, Denzel was unassailable. Bill shifted in his chair, the smile at the corner of his mouth no longer quite reaching his eyes. He tapped his pen against the table once, twice, a subtle admission of discomfort. His world, a world of sharp arguments and armored reason, suddenly felt insufficient against the quiet, devastating truth pouring from the man across from him. The audience knew it too. Phones lay forgotten in laps, comments slowed to a trickle. Even social media feeds, normally quick to crown victors, hesitated, caught between habit and awe. What Denzel offered wasn't something to be scored or debated, it was something to be felt. And for the first time that night, everyone, Bill included, felt small before it. Bill Maher, unwilling to surrender the stage so easily, straightened in his chair and let out a dry chuckle that echoed awkwardly through the studio. "Beautiful words," he said, voice dripping with mock admiration. "But tell me, has faith ever saved anyone from injustice? Or is it just the excuse people use to accept suffering without fighting back?" His tone was sharper now, more desperate, as if trying to reignite the fire of the debate before it slipped entirely from his control. Denzel listened without flinching, his expression unreadable, as if weighing not just the words but the wounds behind them. Bill's challenge wasn't just intellectual, it was personal, almost pleading. It came from a place that knew suffering too, but had chosen armor instead of surrender. Around them the audience tensed, the emotional pendulum swinging wildly between confrontation and revelation. Bill leaned in, pressing the attack. "You talk about standing through the storm. Fine. But standing doesn't fix anything. It doesn't stop injustice. It doesn't change reality. It's just surrender with prettier words." His voice cracked slightly under the weight of his own conviction, the mask of cold reason beginning to slip, revealing the raw fear beneath, the fear that maybe some battles couldn't be won by argument alone. Still, Denzel said nothing. His silence wasn't passive, it was sovereign. He let Bill's words hang in the air, heavy and sour, giving them space to reveal their own emptiness. In that space, something ancient stirred in the audience, a recognition that true power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply endures, unshaken, while lesser forces exhaust themselves against it. The studio lights seemed to burn hotter, casting sharper contrasts across the table. Two men, two worlds, locked in a battle that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with surviving differently. Bill wiped his hand across his forehead, as if to chase away the growing discomfort. But it was too late. The energy in the room had shifted irrevocably, bending toward Denzel's gravity. In homes across the world, viewers leaned closer, some feeling the sting of Bill's words, others feeling the quiet pull of Denzel's presence. It was not an argument that was unfolding now, it was a test of the human spirit. And deep down, everyone watching knew, Only one of them was standing on ground that couldn't be shaken. If you believe that standing strong through suffering is a victory in itself, support this message by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Together, we keep these stories alive. Finally, Denzel moved, not with the urgency of someone needing to defend, but with the deliberateness of someone carrying something sacred. His voice, low and steady, cut through the thick tension like a quiet bell in a fog. "Let me tell you a story," he began, the simple words pulling the room into stillness. Even Bill, arms crossed and brow furrowed, paused his assault, sensing that whatever was coming wasn't an argument, it was a truth too heavy to interrupt. "There was a woman," Denzel said, "named Maria. She lost everything. A fire that took her home, her family, her whole world reduced to ash in one night." His eyes didn't waver from Bill's. He spoke as if summoning the memory from somewhere painfully real. No insurance, no safety net, no way out. Just a pile of rubble where her life used to be. His words painted the image with brutal simplicity, forcing everyone to see it, to feel the smoke in their lungs and the weight of loss pressing on their chests. The audience fell into a collective breath hold, drawn into the rawness of the moment. "Logic didn't save her," Denzel continued, his voice tightening. "Science didn't replace her children's laughter. Reason didn't fill the empty rooms at night." He wasn't condemning those things, he was simply laying bare their limits. What saved her was something you can't put under a microscope. It was faith. Faith that tomorrow would not always look like today. Bill shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping an irregular rhythm against the table, but he said nothing. His usual arsenal, sarcasm, statistics, sharp comebacks, suddenly felt small against the immensity of what Denzel was offering. This wasn't a philosophical debate anymore. It was a glimpse into the unbearable places human beings are sometimes forced to stand, and how some survive it without becoming hollow. "Maria rebuilt her life," Denzel said, voice soft but unbreakable. "Not because she denied the pain, not because she pretended everything was fine, but because she believed in something she couldn't see, couldn't measure, couldn't prove. And that belief gave her the strength to keep breathing when breathing itself felt like a betrayal." Across the studio, a hush blanketed the room, deeper than silence, deeper than words. In living rooms, coffee shops, and quiet bedrooms around the world, people felt something stir, a flicker of recognition, of grief, of impossible endurance. It was a moment so pure that even Bill Maher, for all his practiced cynicism, couldn't look away. As Denzel's final words dissolved into the charged silence, the air inside the studio seemed to change texture, heavier, almost sacred. The studio lights, once harsh and clinical, now felt dimmer, as if the very atmosphere had thickened with the weight of something unspoken. There was no applause, no laughter, no immediate response. Only the heavy breathing of an audience confronted not with entertainment, but with something dangerously real. Human fragility and human endurance, side by side. Bill Maher opened his mouth slightly, as if to deliver a retort, but the words faltered before reaching the air. He glanced around the room as if suddenly realizing that the battle had shifted terrain without his consent. This was no longer a sparring match he could win with sharper wit or quicker comebacks. The audience wasn't judging anymore, they were feeling. And in that new arena, sarcasm had no oxygen left to breathe. Across the world, viewers leaned back from their screens, overwhelmed by an emotion many couldn't immediately name. Some wiped their eyes without quite knowing why. Others simply sat frozen, grappling with the sudden understanding that strength isn't always loud and resilience isn't always rational. Social media feeds, moments before flooded with jokes and memes, began to fill with stunned silence, broken only by simple, powerful phrases like, "I felt that." The moderator, caught between his role as a neutral conductor and a human being moved beyond words, shifted awkwardly in his seat. He looked from Denzel to Bill, silently urging the conversation forward, but knowing that whatever came next would be haunted by the ghost of what had just unfolded. The dynamic had changed forever. There was no path back to the comfortable sparring that had opened the evening. Bill, for his part, tried to regroup. He straightened his posture, ran a hand across his face, and forced a tight smile. "Touching story," he said, voice brittle around the edges, But feelings aren't facts. Yet even as he said it, the words hung limp and hollow, powerless against the tide of lived truth that had flooded the room. It was a defense made too late, a shield raised after the arrow had already pierced the heart. In that moment it became painfully clear. Logic could argue, reason could explain, but only something deeper, something raw and unseen, could truly move a soul. And as the cameras kept rolling, capturing every crack in the armor, it was Denzel's quiet endurance, not Bill's sharpened intellect, that filled the frame. Sensing the shifting tides, Bill Maher leaned forward, summoning the last reserves of his defiance. His voice, though steady, carried an edge of urgency. "So faith is just coping, then," he said, the words snapping through the heavy air. "It's surviving, not winning. It's surrender to the things you can't control." His eyes locked onto Denzel's, a final challenge burning in them. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a plea, a demand for Denzel to admit that faith was just weakness dressed in noble words. Denzel didn't rush to answer. He let the accusation hang between them, letting it soak into the room like rain into dry earth. His silence wasn't passive, it was active, like a craftsman selecting the right tool before shaping something that could last. Viewers around the world could feel the pause stretching, taut and deliberate, pulling them closer, tightening the knot in their chests. Even Bill, though he masked it well, seemed to shrink slightly in the stillness. Then, with the quiet authority of someone who had stood in storms others couldn't imagine, Denzel spoke. "You think surviving is surrender?" His voice was almost tender, almost sorrowful. "Real power isn't about controlling the storm. It's about standing when the storm has done everything it can to break you. And you're still here." His words didn't rise in volume, they sank deeper, cutting through armor, cutting through pretense, straight into the marrow. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Bill blinked once, his face flickering with something unguarded. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. The audience sat frozen, as if afraid that even breathing too loudly would shatter the fragile enormity of the moment. Somewhere deep inside the control room, a producer whispered, "Don't cut. Don't touch it. Let it breathe." Bill opened his mouth again, but the words died before they could form. He closed it slowly, a small, almost imperceptible nod betraying a shift too honest to hide. It wasn't agreement. Bill was too proud, too committed for that. It was something more human, more complicated, the acknowledgement of a truth too raw to debate, too vast to dismiss. In homes across continents, people wiped their eyes, not because they had been persuaded, but because they had been touched. For the first time that night, belief and skepticism were no longer at war. They were two wounded soldiers sitting in the aftermath, recognizing each other's scars. Denzel remained still for a long moment after his words fell into the charged silence, as if giving them space to sink deeper into the room, into the bones of everyone watching. He wasn't there to dominate, and he wasn't there to convert. He was there to reveal. And what he revealed was a power that didn't roar, didn't demand. It simply existed, unbreakable, like a stone shaped by endless tides yet never erased. Power, in his hands, wasn't about conquest. It was about endurance with dignity. Turning slightly toward the audience, Denzel allowed his voice to soften almost into a whisper. "Real strength," he said, "isn't in bending the world to your will. It's in refusing to let the world bend you out of who you are." His words felt ancient, like something spoken around fires long before history had a name. Across the studio, heads nodded unconsciously, not in agreement with an argument, but in recognition of something they had always known, but had never heard spoken so plainly. Bill Maher sat rigid, his jaw tight, his hands clenching the edges of the table. But there was no attack left in him now. There was only the uncomfortable awareness that he was sitting opposite a man who had suffered and endured in ways arguments could neither mock nor diminish. Bill wasn't defeated by logic. He was outlasted by truth. The studio audience shifted again, but this time not from discomfort. It was a subtle, collective leaning toward Denzel, as if seeking shelter under the quiet certainty he embodied. For many in the crowd, and for millions watching around the world, the battle lines of the debate dissolved completely. It wasn't about faith versus reason anymore. It was about what survives when life strips everything else away, In living rooms, offices, and lonely apartments, viewers sat in stunned silence, feeling something stir inside them, something stubborn and raw and ancient. It wasn't about winning arguments or building proofs. It was about finding the courage to stand, bruised but unbroken, against everything that sought to shatter them. It was about resilience, not as an idea, but as a lived, breathing reality. And as Denzel sat back in his chair, not triumphant but grounded, the cameras caught something rare, the transformation of an argument into a moment of human revelation. A moment that would not be measured in applause or trending hashtags, but in the quiet choices people would make long after the lights went down. The moderator, sensing the weight of the moment, hesitated before speaking, his hand hovering uncertainly over the microphone. But he knew, everyone knew, that anything said now would only dilute what had been laid bare. So he remained silent, joining the hush that had claimed the studio like a solemn vow. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was reverence, the collective intake of breath when something sacred has passed through unnoticed doors. Bill Maher sat frozen, his fingers curled into fists on the table, his mouth slightly open, as if still searching for a counterpoint that would not come. The words had abandoned him, not out of defeat, but because there was no battle left to fight. He wasn't facing an argument anymore. He was facing a reality too vast to debate, too deeply rooted to tear down. The sarcasm that once armed him so effectively now felt childish and brittle against the immensity of lived resilience. The camera panned slowly between the two men, catching the raw, unguarded humanity in both faces. Denzel's gaze was lowered slightly, not in triumph, but in quiet respect for the gravity of what had just transpired. Bill's face, so often animated with clever jabs and cutting humor, was now still, almost humbled, almost reflective, caught in the unfamiliar territory of awe. In living rooms across the world, televisions flickered as viewers sat unmoving, absorbing the moment. Some wiped their eyes, some simply stared, feeling emotions too complex to name. It wasn't about faith winning over atheism or intellect bowing to belief. It was about the human spirit, wounded, battered, and still standing, being recognized in its most naked form. It was about the cost of hope and the invisible battles fought in the silence of everyday survival. For a long, fragile moment, the studio existed outside of time. No scripts, no comebacks, no edits, just raw presence. One man bearing the scars of endurance, another recognizing them for the first time not as weakness, but as an unspoken kind of victory. Even the cameras, still rolling, seemed reluctant to disturb what had settled over the room. And when Bill Maher finally looked down, away from Denzel, it wasn't with anger or defeat. It was with the quiet, heavy acceptance that some truths are not argued, they are carried. And in that silent acknowledgement, something broke open, not between opponents, but between two battered parts of the same wounded human family. In the stillness that followed, Bill Maher lifted his eyes again and met Denzel's gaze, not with defiance, not with mockery, but with something rawer, something stripped of the armor he had worn for so long. His jaw tightened, as if wrestling with 1,000 unspoken words. Then, almost imperceptibly, he gave a slight nod. Not a concession of defeat, but an acknowledgement of something larger than the debate, something beyond the reach of intellect alone. It was the kind of gesture that could have easily been missed if the cameras weren't still rolling, capturing every microscopic crack in the facade. Yet for those who caught it, it carried the weight of an entire lifetime of battles, seen and unseen. Bill wasn't admitting that faith was superior. He was recognizing the undeniable strength it had forged in people like Maria, in people like Denzel. Strength that could not be explained away, only respected. Denzel didn't gloat. He didn't smile triumphantly. He simply nodded back, equally small, equally powerful, bridging the chasm between two worldviews with a shared, silent understanding. It wasn't agreement. It was something purer. The recognition that survival sometimes demands more than reason, that resilience sometimes blooms not from answers, but from the refusal to collapse under the weight of unanswered questions. The audience, sensing the rare and precious nature of what had just transpired, remained hushed. It was as if any sound might shatter the fragile, sacred space that had opened between the two men. In homes across the world, viewers sat spellbound, witnessing something that felt older than argument, older than division. A wordless communion between wounded spirits who had taken different roads to the same silent prayer. Endurance. The moderator, with a wisdom born from experience, refrained from jumping in. No clever transitions, no applause cues, just the silence, letting it linger, letting it brand itself into the memory of everyone present. It wasn't the kind of moment you could script. It wasn't entertainment. It was life itself in all its broken, stubborn glory, flashing raw and unfiltered across the airwaves. And as the world watched, many felt something break loose inside them, something hopeful, something defiant. It was the realization that even in the fiercest battles of belief and skepticism, there remains a space where two human souls can meet, not to conquer, but to witness each other's survival. The broadcast ended without fanfare, without a triumphant exit or a clever sign-off. It simply faded to black, leaving millions of viewers sitting in stunned silence before their screens. But the silence didn't last. Within minutes, clips of the exchange flooded social media like an unstoppable tide. Short videos, quotes, reaction threads, all spinning out across the digital world, carried by something deeper than curiosity. It wasn't controversy driving the surge, it was resonance. Across platforms, people shared the moment not as a victory for one side or the other, but as something rare and profoundly human. The most powerful minute of television this year, some headlines proclaimed. Others simply wrote, "I didn't expect to cry tonight," or "This changed something in me." Comments poured in from every corner of belief and unbelief, from pastors to atheists, from scientists to artists, each confessing that for a brief, burning moment they had felt the common weight of survival. Clips of Denzel's words about the storm, about standing in its aftermath, were reposted with captions like, "Save this for when you need strength," and "Proof that endurance is a kind of revolution." The debate wasn't trending because of outrage. It was trending because it had touched the nerve that runs beneath every ideology, the desperate, stubborn human spirit that refuses to be crushed. Even celebrities chimed in, sharing their own experiences with resilience and faith, admitting that the exchange had cracked open something inside them they usually kept hidden from public view. It wasn't about religious conversion. It wasn't about winning philosophical points. It was about recognizing that suffering levels us all, and that dignity in suffering is its own quiet form of victory. Producers scrambled to respond to the tidal wave of attention. Networks replayed the segment. Talk shows dissected it. Op-eds poured in. But none of their explanations captured what those few unguarded minutes had given to the world. It wasn't spectacle. It was solidarity. A reminder that beneath our arguments and labels, there are battles we all fight, silently, invisibly, and that sometimes simply standing is the bravest act of all. And in the midst of it all, Denzel Washington, true to form, remained silent. No tweets, no victory laps, no self-congratulation, because the moment didn't belong to him, or to Bill Maher, or even to the debate. It belonged to everyone who had ever weathered a storm and dared to stand again. As the days passed, it became clear that what had resonated so deeply wasn't about dogma. It wasn't about organized religion or ideological camps. It was about something older, more primal, a kind of faith that existed beyond the walls of any church or the boundaries of any belief system. Denzel's story, his calm, his endurance, they spoke to something universal, the ability of the human spirit to hold on to hope even when reason offers none. Social media posts reflected this shift. Atheists, agnostics, believers of every stripe found common ground not in theology, but in the raw recognition of suffering and survival. One viral comment summed it up perfectly. "You don't have to believe in God to believe in getting back up when life breaks you." And in that shared recognition, for once, the internet didn't fracture into tribalism. It united in a kind of unspoken reverence. Denzel's words about standing in the storm took on a life of their own. Teachers shared them with students. Counselors quoted them in therapy sessions. Survivors of trauma, illness, and loss reposted them with simple, heartfelt captions. "This is what saved me." In a world addicted to cynicism and conflict, a rare chord had been struck, one that vibrated in the hidden chambers of human resilience. Bill Maher, for his part, offered no formal statement afterward. Perhaps he understood that to explain away what had happened would only diminish it. Perhaps deep down he knew that sometimes the greatest acknowledgement of truth is silence. And so, the moment stood untouched, an unrepeatable collision between skepticism and faith that transcended both. Commentators tried to fit it into neat categories. Was it a religious awakening, a social phenomenon, a cultural anomaly? But none of their explanations quite captured the simple, stubborn mystery at the heart of it, that human beings, regardless of what they believe or don't believe, need something to hold on to when the world collapses around them. And for one night, one fragile, unforgettable night, millions of people glimpsed that something. They didn't argue about it. They didn't politicize it. They just felt it, like the faint, stubborn beating of a heart under layers of armor. And for many, that glimpse was enough to reignite a faith not in doctrines but in the very act of standing. In the weeks that followed, testimonials flooded the internet, not from people proclaiming sudden conversions, but from individuals acknowledging something far more profound, a change in how they viewed strength, suffering, and survival. Thousands who had once scoffed at the idea of faith admitted they were moved, not into churches or religions, but into a deeper respect for the unseen battles fought inside every human soul. Atheists wrote about crying during the clip, not because they had found God, but because they had recognized themselves in Maria's story, in the rubble, in the loneliness, in the desperate choice to keep breathing when nothing made sense. Skeptics who prided themselves on ruthless logic confessed to feeling a crack open in their walls of certainty, not eroding their minds, but softening their hearts. The story traveled beyond the confines of typical audiences. Military veterans shared it in support groups, talking about how faith, not always in God but in each other, in purpose, in tomorrow, had carried them through unspeakable darkness. Cancer survivors posted fragments of Denzel's words beside photos of their scars. Refugees in distant lands, with nothing left but hope, shared the video, seeing in it a reflection of their own invisible wars. It became clear that Denzel hadn't just defended faith that night, he had redefined it. Not as blind belief, not as dogma, but as a fierce, stubborn act of resistance against despair. Faith, in his framing, was no longer about answers. It was about standing when the world demanded you fall. It was about refusing to let loss steal your soul. Bill Maher, though silent, became part of the story too. Not as a villain, but as a mirror, a reminder that skepticism also springs from pain, that the need to mock belief can sometimes hide the deeper terror of believing in nothing. In the end, it wasn't Denzel against Bill. It was two wounded survivors grappling, unknowingly, for the same fragile hope. And across the world, where the storms of life never truly cease, people tucked Denzel's words into their hearts like a lifeline. Not because they needed to win an argument, but because, in the silence that followed the debate, they remembered something vital. Sometimes surviving is not a failure. Sometimes surviving is the victory. Long after the trending hashtags faded and the news cycles moved on, the debate between Denzel Washington and Bill Maher lived on. Not as a viral moment, but as a quiet ember burning in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. It was not remembered for who won or who lost. It was remembered for the way silence spoke louder than argument, and how endurance, when worn without pride or apology, could reshape the very meaning of power. In classrooms, churches, therapy sessions, and living rooms, fragments of that night resurfaced in conversations about resilience, dignity, and hope. People quoted Denzel's words about storms and standing, passing them like heirlooms to friends, students, and strangers who needed to hear them. The message rippled outward, not tethered to any ideology, but rooted in something larger and older, the stubborn will to survive with grace. Years later, journalists reflecting on the most unexpected cultural moments of the decade often cited that debate. They didn't speak about it as a clash of ideas. They spoke about it as a rare moment of collective vulnerability, when two men from opposite shores of belief stood naked before the human condition and for once didn't flinch. They allowed the world to see what survival truly costs and why it matters. Denzel never addressed the event again publicly. He didn't need to. His silence was its own continuation of the message. Some truths don't need repetition. They are lived, not argued. Bill Maher, too, never revisited the conversation. Some speculated it had softened something in him. Others said it had simply humbled him in ways words could never express. But in truth, the change wasn't about them. It was about all of us. The true legacy of that night wasn't a meme, a headline, or a soundbite. It was the quiet, private choices made afterward. A single mother deciding to keep going after another closed door. A grieving husband finding a reason to rise from bed. A frightened teenager daring to hope that broken doesn't mean finished. Each act of standing, invisible and uncelebrated, traced its roots back to that unforgettable, wordless understanding between two men. And so what began as a televised debate ended as something far greater. A whispered legacy of strength passed hand to hand, heart to heart, across a wounded but unbreakable world. Tonight wasn't about winning an argument. It was about showing that real strength isn't measured by how loud you speak. It's measured by how deeply you endure, without losing your soul. Denzel Washington didn't just defend faith. He redefined what it means to survive with dignity. Have you ever faced a moment when standing strong meant more than winning? Share your story in the comments. We would love to hear it. If this message touched you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Every story of resilience deserves to be heard, and this is just the beginning. Our next video will take you even deeper into the unseen battles that shape true strength. Stay with us. You won't want to miss it.